Hi, welcome everybody. My name is JD and this is my channel Frost and Forest. So today I am going to talk a little bit about my deck collection, and I'm going to talk about some of the decks that I actually have 2 copies of and the reason why I have 2 copies of. So in general, I'm of the belief that if a deck is, if something happens to one of my decks and then I am not able to get another copy of it for whatever reason, then that deck has moved out of my life, and that's just the way it's supposed to be. Especially because, when I'm thinking about collecting decks, I like to be conscientious about my collection, and I feel like it could be kind of a slippery slope to worry about having backup copies of the decks. That said, that's just my perspective. Anyone that may have a different perspective than me, that is, I think that that's great. I think we all have our own collections, and we all think about our collections and curate our collections in the way that works for us. And so today I'm going to be talking to you about the way that I curate my collection. So the first reason why I sometimes have 2 decks is, kind of contradictory to what I just said, but these are decks that I actually would feel pretty bad about if I didn't have a copy of them. So these, in this case, are the next few decks that I'm going to show you are kind of the only true duplicates, that there's nothing different about them. They are the exact same decks. I just have 2 of them. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is the Wisdom of the Cailleach. This is a deck that I just talked about in a video, so I won't talk about it too much here. But for me, this is a deck that is a very spiritual deck for me, and it's a deck that I really value. It is also a deck that is independently published, and it's published by an Irish creator. And basically this Irish creator has one publication, or like one lot of decks that she releases every year. So if if something were to happen to this deck in the time period between the next time she has her lot, which is usually kind of early or late spring or early summer, if I remember correctly, then it would be really hard for me to get this deck as a replacement. I would be paying out of deck prices, and it'd be hard. And so I do actually have just a true backup copy of this deck, because it is a deck that is very important to me. It's very spiritual for me, and it is a deck that I want to make sure I have a copy in my life. So this is the first deck that I'm going to share. What I'm going to show you is the Mystical Medley. So this is a deck that is a Liminal 11 deck. And this is a deck that kind of means a lot to me. When I was younger and when I was a kid, I used to watch a lot of older cartoons that are in this sort of animation style with my dad. And so it is kind of an important deck to me, and I would be really sad if I didn't have a copy of this. I don't actually use this deck very often for readings, but it is just a deck that I sort of have an emotional connection to. That was a reason to get a backup copy of this deck, because I do have that sort of familial, emotional connection to this deck. The second reason why I might have 2 copies of a deck is that I have 2 different sizes of the deck. This is especially true for me because I have small hands, and so in many cases, smaller pocket-sized decks are easier for me to shuffle. In a lot of these cases that I'm going to show you, a pocket deck has been offered, or a pocket deck has come out later, and so I have decided to get that pocket version as well. So the first one that fits this example is the Prisma Visions. I definitely got the larger edition first. Oops. And mine is one from the earlier editions where it has that sort of glossy cardstock. And you can kind of see it's very reflective. So it has the glossy cardstock. And so I got this first. It's a deck that I really like. I love this sort of impressionist art style to it. I love that you can line the cards up and tell a story. I really like this deck. This is also a deck that, oops, this is upside down. This is also a deck that my husband likes in particular. And so, you know, this is a deck that I like having the original copy because it was a present from him. But then later on, this mini edition came out. And so I decided to get the mini edition. I think I got this one maybe in a trade. But I decided to get the mini edition. And this one is a little bit different. It's that more matte cardstock. But yeah, I'm okay having both of these decks, especially because this is a present, and you know, this is a smaller version that's pretty easy for me to shuffle. This version is a little bit harder for me to shuffle. And it's kind of nice because I have brought this deck, the smaller version, along with me when I have gone traveling or especially when I've had to travel on a flight for work. It's a lot easier to bring this teeny tiny little deck than this one. So yeah, this is one example of a deck that I have two different sizes of. The next deck that I have that I got because had two different sizes were the Quiet Rebel Oracle. So I got both of these decks through the Kickstarter. I love this deck. It is so intuitive to me. It looks amazing with the Quiet Rebel Tarot, and it's a really fun deck, but also a little bit more serious than maybe you would expect. And so I ended up deciding to get the pocket edition along with the bigger edition because honestly, I was a little bit worried that I would have trouble shuffling the bigger edition. I have another deck by this creator that is an oracle deck. It's called I think it's like Spirit Animals of the Celtic Isles. I'll put it on the screen. And I have a little bit of trouble shuffling that deck. And so I decided to buy the pocket deck because just in case this one is hard to shuffle, I wanted to have something that was a little easier to shuffle. I will also say it's nice to have both versions of this deck because this one comes with a guidebook or a physical guidebook, and this one comes with a digital guidebook. And so it's kind of nice to have both of these. I'm going to be honest, when I first got this Kickstarter, or like when I first backed this Kickstarter, I was very convinced that I would likely get both of them and rehome the bigger one and keep the little one. But what I actually found is that I enjoy the size of the art. Oh, this is a perfect example. There we go. I enjoy the size of the art in the bigger ones. It really holds the place as an oracle deck. It can be very central to a reading. And so I actually really like it in this size. And it's not too hard for me to smaller one. The art doesn't feel so big. So then I was thinking, well, I like the way that this one looks with other decks, normal tarot size decks. So maybe I should rehome the little one. But the little one looks really great with our tarot. It's a deck that I really like. It focuses on women, and each card is related to a different woman, and that deck looks really good with this deck. And so I like having the little pocket one to be able to go with our tarot. I'll also say that, you know, this one will be a good one if I do decide to bring it with me when I travel. And it has a digital guidebook, so, you know, I don't have to be bringing a whole guidebook along with me. So this is another one that I decided to get 2 copies of. So the third reason that I have 2 copies of a deck is because one edition had extra cards. So for this one, I had the first edition of this deck. I loved it, but then a second edition came out and the creator added more cards, and so I wanted to get the second edition. And so for this one, these are the Creatures Oracle. So this Creatures Oracle is one of my most favorite Oracle decks ever. I think, you know, if we lived in a world where I could maybe only have one Oracle deck, it would probably be this deck. I love this deck a lot. And so, you know, basically this is the first edition, and this is actually super interesting. The first edition comes in this almost like vinyl-y feeling cardstock. Like, listen to this. It's super interesting. It shuffles really well, but it's this like really plasticky, vinyl-y cardstock. And so I got the first edition. I had it. I loved it. And then a little while later, she came out with a second edition where she added, I don't know how many cards it was. I don't know. I don't remember. She added some new cards. And so I decided to get the second edition as well because I wanted to get the new cards. And I also, this is one of those decks that I would be really sad if I didn't have a copy of this deck. And she does restock her decks every once in a while, especially after she's done a Kickstarter, but it is the kind of deck that is not always readily available. And so having the first and the second edition makes sure I have a copy of it. But also, you know, there are reasons why I like both of the editions. I kind of like the way that this shuffles, and I like the way it feels, even though it's that kind of vinyl-y covering. And so a lot of times I do find myself pulling this edition of it. But this second edition is much smoother. It's more kind of like a normal cardstock. And this one comes with a longer guidebook entry beyond just coming with more cards. And so, oh, here we go. You can kind of see that the art hasn't changed a ton from it, but it does look slightly different. And so just with the extra cards and the extra guidebook and the fact that I want to have a copy of this deck because it's my favorite Oracle, I decided to get both versions of this deck. Okay, so then moving on to the last reason why I might have 2 different copies of a deck. And that last reason is that there are actually differences between the 2 decks. So basically for these decks, in some cases there were just pretty minor changes, but in other cases there were pretty drastic differences between the 2 different editions. So I will maybe try to start with ones that only have slight changes, and then move on to some of the ones that are more drastically different. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is the Creatures Tarot. So this is the tarot deck connected to the Oracle deck that I just showed you all. And this one, I will say, she is actually opening her shop up back pretty soon, and I think she has some copies of the second edition of this deck. So if this is a deck that you're interested in, I do think that there are going to be some that are available soon. And so with this deck, there were actually pretty minor changes that were done in this deck, but I wanted to get the second edition because, one, I do really like this art style, I really like this creator, I like to support her, but also there were some changes that I think she has grown a little bit as an artist, and so she did some sort of touching up to the cards that I think gave it a little bit more life. And so I wanted to have that second edition to really look at it and have both copies. The other thing that was kind of cool is, so for the first edition, she did a, I can start showing cards. For the first edition, she did had, you know, all of the major arcana, but then there was add-ons that you could do. I have to get these flipping right. So let me start over. Basically, for this first edition, there was, you know, a major arcana that came with the deck. But then for that first Kickstarter, there were also an add-on of another set of major arcana cards that you could get, so that you could kind of choose which one you like. But in this deck, in the second edition, she actually gave you both of the cards. So you can see that you get both of them. And so this is the second edition. And so there were not, and so for this first one, I basically chose the one that I liked for both of them and kept that in the deck. With this one, I'm thinking about maybe just leaving both in there to see how it goes, because I kind of like having both of them in there, but we'll see. And so again, the changes that were made are pretty light, but here's one that we're coming to. So like, this is an example of a card with some changes. As you can see, she sort of lightened up this background of the tree, and she sort of focused in on the creature and the hermit card. And so there's just, you know, it's a slight change, but it is a change that I think draws your attention to the creature instead of the creature getting a little bit more lost in this first edition. So yeah, this one is definitely one where the changes, but like even here, like you can see, oh, I guess, never mind. The death, these are beautiful death cards. I'm trying to find another one where there was some changes. I don't know. I'm not seeing anything now, but also I do think that there were a few cards that she changed completely in this new edition. They're just completely different cards, but there were not many like that. But like here, for example, she changed the color of the creature. This creature is pink. This one kind of matches the deck a little bit more. So this is kind of, I won't show you all the cards because there are many walkthroughs out there of this deck. It's a great deck. I love it almost as much as I love the Oracle deck, but this is one that there were only slight changes to the second edition. The next deck that I'm going to talk about, that I have 2 copies of the deck because they look different. And again, this is one that I would say the changes are relatively minor-ish, but you can definitely tell the difference. So the next deck that I'm going to talk to you about is the Tarot of Aphrodite. I am not going to show you the boxes, which is silly, but because it seems like there has been more concern about nudity in videos lately, and the boxes definitely have artistic nudity on them. So the next decks that I'm going to talk to you about are the Tarot of Aphrodite. And I have tried to go through and pull out pull out the cards that do have nudity in them. So the reason that these piles look really thin is because I only have internet safe ones. So this is the first edition of this deck, and then this is the second edition of this deck. And so you can see that they do look a little bit different. The border on this one is a little bit pinker. The border on this one is a little bit, like it just looks really classy. But it has, it is a lighter pink, a little paler. And so it has changed. The size of the deck has also changed a teeny bit. It's not a ton, but as you can see, the second edition is a little bit bigger. And so I have 2 copies of this deck because I actually personally, if we were just looking at cards alone, I personally prefer the first edition. Part of the reason why I love this deck is for this explicit pink color. And so I really like that this deck is a stronger pink. Oops. And I will also say that this first edition is easier for me to shuffle. The size might not look that different, but the slightly smaller card just makes it easier for me to shuffle. Oh, this is great. So we can kind of see the 2 different ones. We can see them together. But yeah, so this card is slightly smaller, so it's easier for me to shuffle. But the reason why, because you might be thinking, well, why don't you just keep the first edition? Well, the reason I don't keep the first edition is because, the reason why I don't just keep the first edition is because this second edition actually comes with a guidebook meaning. The first edition does come with a guidebook, but it's kind of like it's kind of more just what the card is and what the art is and who the artist is. So it's not like a guidebook meaning, whereas this one has a guidebook meaning. But you can also see that like this one has lightened up a little bit. The art is a little bit bigger in this one. So I think that this one looks beautiful. I just have a soft spot for the first edition. And so what I've actually found myself doing is I shuffle and use the first edition, but I use the guidebook for the second edition. And in most cases that works, because in most cases the art is very the same, but there are a few examples where the art was changed between the first and the second edition. And so, I haven't run into that too often when I've done card pulls, but that might throw it off a little bit. But for now, this is the solution that I have of keeping both editions so that I can have the one that's more usable for me, but also have the guidebook. So now we're going to get into some that have more drastic changes to them. So the next one that I'm going to talk to you about is the Forager's Daughter Tarot. This is another one of those decks that is one of my very favorite decks in the whole wide world. And I could never, I would be really upset and sad if I did not have a copy of this deck. And so I just saw that card, so I'm going to put it back. As you can see with this deck, this is the first edition, and this is the second edition, the Afterlight edition. And so I got the first edition because at the time that I got this deck, that was the edition that was out. And so I decided to get it. But I actually ended up purchasing the Afterlight edition because sort of for that first reason that I talked to you about, that I wanted to have a backup copy of this deck because I love it so much. But at the time, this, as I was starting to think about it, this copy was actually out of print, and this Afterlight edition was the only edition that was available. And so I ended up getting this Afterlight edition as sort of a backup, because even though I tend to prefer, especially starting out, I tend to prefer the first edition. I like the colors. I like the colors borders to indicate the suits. I like kind of the saturation that it feels in that edition. I like the border that kind of looks like trees. And so I do like this edition a lot. Also, as you could kind of see, one of the biggest differences between the two is that the art is in general the same. It just has that sort of different border. And this Afterlight edition has a few extra cards with it as well. But other than that, you know, the size is pretty similar. The first edition is slightly smaller. The backs are also different. But, you know, as I have started having both of these copies, I have actually realized that, I mean, I've kind of grown to like the Afterlight edition more than I was expecting to. And it seems like when I want to use this deck in like the summer and the fall, I tend to like the first edition, but when I want to use this deck in the spring and summer, this edition is the one that I go for. And I will also say that this deck, the different editions pair nicely. Pair nicely with different decks. And so depending on what other kind of decks I'm using in a reading, I might decide to use the first edition or the Afterlight edition, depending. So this is one of my favorite decks in the whole wide world. That's what's kind of been fun about this. I don't know if you've noticed it, but the decks that I tend to have two of are decks that really, really mean a lot to me. And so yeah, this is perfect. So you can kind of see that this card is a little bit bigger, so the art is a little bit bigger. I do think that the Afterlight edition feels a little bit brighter, but I do like the more woodsy feel of the first edition. So, you know, it is what it is. And this creator, I think, is working on an Oracle deck that I am super excited about and I think will be really awesome. Then the last example of a deck that I actually have two different versions of is the Prairie Herbalist Tarot. So these ones are very, very new to me. So they're actually still in order. But what is cool about this deck is that in this case, the cards are very similar, but this one is what the plant looks like in sort of this in the summertime, or you know, when it's flowering or when the leaves are out, whereas this version is what it looks like when it is in the wintertime. And so that I think that that's really cool because I do use decks very seasonally. I'm very connected to nature. And so this is the kind of deck that I would feel really uncomfortable using the very green edition in the summer, or sorry, in the winter, because that's not the way my world is. It's, you know, winter time. And so things look more like this in the winter and fall. But of course, you know, there are some cards are the same card if they're applicable to both time periods. This deck was created by Nicole, and it is really awesome because she actually went out and like took all of these amazing pictures and created this deck and really worked on creating a deck that showed the prairie plants that she would find in her area and then connecting them to the tarot, which I think is awesome. And I would love to someday make a tree deck that is like this, that, you know, goes very specifically into different tree species that are found in my area, I would love to do that. But I just thought that this was so cool, and the area of the world that Nicole is in is very similar to the area of the world that I am in, and I do recognize a lot of these plant species, so I wanted to get this deck, and I am very excited to try to start using it, and I am excited to have a deck, a plant deck, that I can use at multiple times of the year. I do think I've been trying to be intentional about my reasons for having two different decks. A lot of the reason why I do have two versions of it is because they are decks that I really, really love. And so for whatever reason, whether that's I'm worried about not being able to have access to them, or I want to be able to bring them on a trip, I have decided to have two editions of the deck. But in general, I try not to do that. What about you? What are some decks that you maybe have two copies of, or would like to have two copies of? I'd be curious to hear that below. What are some of the reasons why you have two copies of decks? Are they similar to the reasons I have? Or do you have other reasons for having multiple copies of a deck? I'd love to hear. And I just want to thank you so much for joining me for this video. I really appreciate everybody who has subscribed to my channel. My channel is growing slowly but steadily, and I really, really appreciate that. I'm incredibly grateful for that. So, you know, if you haven't subscribed and you're interested in tarot content, you might want to think about doing that. I do post one video a week about tarot, the decks I'm using, the decks I'm thinking about, how I think about my collection and managing my collection, like today. It would also be great if you enjoyed this video, if you could hit the like button. That also helps me out a little bit. So I hope you all are having a great day, and thanks for stopping by.